All right, Enilda, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Enilda Romero-Hall, and I am an associate professor of learning design and technology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I am in the Department of Theory and Practice in Teacher Education, and my specific unit is um, data. Oh my God, we have a completely new name. Design, learning, and data science. Yes. So I work in an interdisciplinary team of scholars. The presentation today is titled Context Matters, Learning Design Practice Through the Global South Perspective. And I have this QR code here. It is more than anything to connect with anyone that is here in this session. It is a link, a connection to my LinkedIn. So if you like to connect, you're welcome to use this QR code. I will have a link to the presentation later on and other goodies and resources for you towards the end of the presentation. So this presentation is focused significantly on a book that I published last year that is titled Learners, Designers, Learning Designers in Context. Apologies for that. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about how this journey started. I was the year 2019, 2020, I was working on a project with some graduate students at that time. I was at the University of Tampa, and I had three graduate students, Lenore Adams, Erica Peterson, Adriana Viana. Lenore is from Peru, Erica Peterson and Adriana Viana are from Brazil. And I am originally from Panama. And we were having conversations about learning design practice and became really curious about what were the competencies required of learning designers in Latin America. We, of course, are all from Latin America, and Adriana, Erica were considering what their practice will be like if they were to return back to their country. So we started working on this project, Educational Technologies in Latin America and the Caribbean, in perceived importance of competencies and practice. And we use a validated survey and we started reaching out to learning designers throughout Latin America that we already knew. Eventually, that led Leonore to connect with Janet Sotelo, who is a learning designer in Peru. And she is sort of the lead of this informal group of learning designers who have a community via WhatsApp. So it's like hundreds of learning designers in Peru that connect via WhatsApp. And she was very gracious. She took our survey and she shared it with the members of her community. And that led us to realize that there is a very large community of learning designers in Latin America, and it got me thinking about the fact that I wanted to learn their journeys. I not only wanted to, have them complete the survey and gather data from them, but I wanted to know how they had started in the field, what professional roles did they play in their organization, what competencies they use that were going to shape their practice. I wanted to learn more about them. And that's how I started my journey into this book. So in August 2020, it was sort of like, we're in the year of the pandemic, all of these things are happening. And I emailed my editor and I said, I have an idea for a book and I want to pursue it. Little did I know what that journey was going to be like and how long it was actually going to take me. But I just followed through with it. So, in this book, Learning Designers in Context, I focus primarily on acknowledging, illustrating, and learning how learning design practice is disseminated broadly in the global South, um, a region that is often underrepresented and is sort of marginalized in our research literature and sometimes in our practice literature as well. I was really curious to also understand what were the pathways that were taking into learning design practice by these instructional designers. They had taken different paths into our practice, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then I was also very interested in understanding the similarities in practices, but also the complete differences depending on the country, the geographical location, the cultural nuances, and things like that. And then what this learning designers thought were the important competencies that they needed to have in their sector, in their culture, in their geographical location that guided or improved their practice. So this was the overall objectives. So, with all of this in mind, a goal to write a book, these objectives that I wanted to accomplish, I set out to make a call to learning designers. It was primarily using LinkedIn and reaching out to members of different professional organizations that I knew practice in the Global South and asking them to disseminate the word about the interviews that I was carrying out. And at first, there was quite a few responses that I received, and especially from Latin America. I was able to connect with several learning designers. It was also fairly easy for me to conduct the interviews because I'm originally from Panama and I'm a native speaker of Spanish. So I felt like I could conduct interviews in Spanish and they felt very comfortable, connecting with me in the same language. So there were quite a few participants from Latin America. I kind of experienced some challenges when connecting with individuals from other parts of the world, other regions in the global south. The time difference made it challenging. Also finding connections in order to identify individuals that I could interview. That also made it a little bit more challenging. But thankfully, I was able to connect with a few colleagues that were in Africa who were able to participate and eager to share their experiences. So overall, I had 13 participants that I was able to integrate into the book. I actually had more interviews that I wanted to integrate into the book, but I ran into some challenges related to like the completeness of the interview or going through the process of translating the interviews. As I mentioned, some of them were in Spanish, and the translation process is not only costly, but is also time intensive. So we had representatives from Chile, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Peru, Trinidad, from Trinidad and Tobago, Tanzania, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, Nigeria, and Peru. So I was very happy that, an honor, to be quite honest, that these learning designers opened up to me and were able to share not only the things that they really enjoyed about their practice, their journey into the practice, but also some of the challenges that they experienced and how they maneuver these challenges. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that intrigued me as I entered into this journey with the learning designers was to know what were the different pathways that they took into the learning design profession, and the practice within their global south context. And just like the experiences that I've had when I meet learning designers in the United States and in other parts of the world, their journey into learning design practice was so broad. They came from all different pathways. Some of them had studied psychology, some of them had studied educational and clinical psychology. Um, Others were coming more from like the business sector and had experience with marketing and graphic design within the business sector. Uh, Others were more into the study of languages. So a few of them talked about being certified translators between English and Spanish, and therefore it sort of opened a path into the learning design field because they had this English language proficiency. Um, Others talked about having history or secondary education background and working with K to 12 teachers. And some were just STEM instructors in their country. And eventually it led to an interest into the use of technology in STEM, and it just transitioned into um, technology integration in K to 12, eventually leading to becoming instructional designers. So their pathways were very broad. Here are a few examples I want to share. Um, for example, Evelyn, who is an instructional design professional in Argentina, talked about how she had studied at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, and she was actually an adjunct instructor. And her area of study was actually focused on literature, but also she had become a certified translator, and because she had that knowledge of pedagogy working at the university and had dominance of the English language, she found herself working for this global corporation that had a headquarters in Houston. And she was able to use her knowledge of pedagogy and, and language of understanding of the English language to become an instructional designer, eventually leading to becoming an instructional design manager, um, being the manager of teams across the globe for this corporation that was primarily based in Houston. Then there is Lorena, who is from Puebla, Mexico. And this her background was really interesting because she came from a business background and she had knowledge of graphic design. So she worked in advertising, creating materials for different brands. She mentioned different sports brands that she create materials for. And eventually, she actually became interested in practicing in a very specific organization, which is called Provident, which is located in Puebla. And she entered the organization primarily through a role in like as an administrator working in human resources, but was able to use her background in graphic design to focus on creating materials that were primarily for an HR department and transitioning eventually into creating instructional design materials, which eventually led her to serve as an instructional design manager. So it was sort of like going from the business world and having this knowledge of graphic design and understanding training and education and transitioning into instructional design practice. And then there were others like Celia, who is an instructional design manager, specifically the director of online education at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, who started working as an administrative assistant within the university, understanding the ins and outs of the higher education system within her institution, then working on also graphic design, and eventually leading to her earning her PhD in education and specializing in curriculum and learning technologies. And she sort of worked her way up the institution and led her to this role as a director of online learning. And in all of this, sorry, three cases, um, the instructional designers sort of use their expertise and background to um, kind of enter the field, grow within the field, and then eventually lead to a leading role within their organization. So as you can see, their way into instructional design wasn't a direct path. Like many of our instructional designers, I see some of my students, they are coming from different majors, but then eventually leading to an instructional design degree and working their way into an instructional design role. It more their pathways were more um, non-linear. They were working as instructional designers, but came from different majors and then different professional fields. So another aspect of this like overall investigation into looking at learning designers in the Global South was to understand how they transform some of the challenges that they experience into innovation within their workplace. Um, and some of the challenges that learning designers experience related to navigating some of the unique demographics that they have because of different cultures coming together. There's also, I wouldn't say necessarily a challenge, but a unique aspect that they have is that they may have different traditions that come together. And there is issues related to resources or lack of resources that they may have experienced. And some examples that I want to use to illustrate this and these are just a few of them because I know that I'm on a limited time. But for example, I talked to Kito, who is an instructional designer in Tanzania, and he worked specifically in the financial sector. He worked for one of the largest bank in the capital of Tanzania. And in this particular context, he talked about most of the instruction that was created was often created in English. However, the individuals who work within in the organization and for whom the training was actually created were speakers of Swahili. So having the language of instruction primarily in English often caused the individuals to kind of like overlook the instruction. And he felt like it was important to have elements of the native language integrated into the instruction. So, like, I'm a Spanish speaker. So in Spanish, we have Spanglish, where we combine English and Spanish. Um, and I don't want to come up with a word for Swahili, but it was sort of like a similar yeah, a similar experience in which he combined English and Swahili in order to make the online training more motivated for those who were going to experience it. So it was sort of like thinking about the needs of the learners and ensuring that they were considered when we are, creating the instruction. A very similar experience was had by Kaya, who was an instructional designer in South Africa. And she talked about how in South Africa there are 12 different languages or dialects that are spoken by the individuals in this country. And although the university primarily would use English as their language of instruction, um, and most of the courses were developed in English, there were some initial efforts that were created for integrating Afrikaans and Zulu as languages of the courses that were offered. And one of the things that her manager and her benefited from was that they were both very proficient in these two languages. So as the university was evolving in their creation of courses for this individuals who spoke these two languages, they sort of served as leaders in this efforts because they both spoke African and Zulu, sorry. So they, it kind of served of benefit to them as a competence as instructional designers in this specific context. Another aspect, as I mentioned, is the aspect of tradition that this learning designer, some of these learning designers may have experienced. And I thought this was very a particular important issue for one of the instructional designers that I interview, and her name was Isabel. And um, in this particular context, Isabel talked about how she was an instructional designer within a team that was creating instructional materials for an indigenous communities in the Andes in Peru. And as part of this instructional team, she had to be very aware of the cultural traditions of the indigenous group. And one of the things that she noticed as she was interacting with the indigenous group was that the males within the tribe were authority. They had this authority in the public aspect of the community. But she noticed that within the home, the women were those that had the authority and the guidance. So although she felt like she had to interact with the male members of the tribe in order to kind of like gain their trust and understand their traditions, she also felt like the team had to work closely with the women within the tribe in order to kind of, I wouldn't say persuade, but also gain knowledge and know how to gain trust as well. So understanding this tradition was of benefit to her as she was working as an instructional design, creating materials for them. And she actually mentioned that this experience influenced her in taking some anthropology courses when she went back for her studies, but because she understood the role of culture and how what we may perceive as important, or what who we perceive as important, so the stakeholders that we're interacting with may not be very obvious after we kind of like gain knowledge about the traditions and cultural aspects when we're interacting with those who we are creating instruction for. And then there was quite a bit of conversation as I was interviewing the different learning designers related to the specific context that they were in, whether it was the sector that they worked in or the geographical location that they were in, or the practice that they had, and the resources that were available to them or lack of resources that were available to them. um, so, for example, when I was interacting with Lorena, who's from Puebla, Mexico, in her context, she worked for Provident, which is an organization that kind of provided microloans for individuals across a certain region of Mexico. Uh, these microloans were actually sort of like managed within the region by independent contractors, independent consultants. And the training that she created was actually deployed to the independent contractors. And the independent contractors were primarily women who didn't have like high tech. So in her context, the training had to be deployed in very low bandwidth learning environments. And it also had to be deployed in mobile learning formats because the independent contractors were individuals that didn't have laptop computers or desktop computers in their homes, and they also didn't have like high-speed internet access. They primarily had their mobile phones, and in their mobile phones they had limited amount of data. So she had to be very creative about the instructional materials that she created for this independent contractors, and she had to be aware that they were also going to be viewing these instructional materials using mobile technology. Um, In another interview, I talked to Sherelle, who was a K to 12 teacher in Trinidad. And she was at that time enrolled in a PhD program. And in her PhD program, as they were working in creating instructional materials, her PhD program was on emergent technologies. Her and her classmates noticed that in the process of creating multimedia environments for her students or for whoever they were creating these multimedia environments, they noticed that there was really a lack of representation when it came to the creation of Indo-Chinese people or individuals who were representative of Caribbean culture. Trinidad and Tobago is a country in which multiple cultures come together, and she wanted to be able to represent to her students who were she was primarily creating these resources for them. She wanted to represent those Indo-Chinese people, and um, she was very um, frustrated with the fact that she wasn't able to find those resources. So her and her classmates, as part of her PhD cohort, were constantly trying to create resources that were representative of Caribbean culture and finding creative ways to represent individuals that she felt were representative of her culture in their material. So they work on this co-creation of resources themselves. Then there was conversations that I had with Isabel in Peru, and she talked about how within her group of colleagues in Peru, they found that there was a lack of resources that were in Spanish. So in the global north, we create quite a few resources, whether it's for our professional organizations or resources that we're publishing or resources that are created as part of our work environment that are instructional design resources. And within her group of colleagues of instructional designers, they kind of put their efforts into translating some of the resources so that they could use them themselves. And then they could use it to sort of like illustrate the instructional design practice within their organization. So the fact that we have so many resources in English, but we cannot, they were not translated into Spanish was, something that was costing her quite a bit. Again, also like frustration. Now, perhaps we have some tools that can help with this translation efforts. They're not always perfect, like perhaps like using artificial intelligence to do this translation, and it may still require human elements to make them more attuned with a very specific cultures or very specific phrases that are used in different countries, but that's perhaps something that can be done now. But at the time of the interview, there were a lack of resources in Spanish, in particular for Peru. Um, and then talking to Celia, who is in Puerto Rico, one of the things that she mentioned to me were the infrastructure issues, especially after Hurricane Maria passed through Puerto Rico. One of the things that they experienced significantly were constant lack of electricity. So although there were access to high-speed internet, they constantly had to work on creating resources that could be deployed um, offline because it would prevent students from like missing out on certain resources because they're having issues with electricity. And it is an issue that is still ongoing. So it caused them to think again creatively of creating offline resources that they could use, the students could use when interacting with instruction to deal with these issues with electricity. So these are some of the challenges and creative ways in which the instructional designers work to continue education despite the challenges. So I also want to talk about some of the competencies that the instructional designers talked about within their specific context. And for the purpose of this presentation, I've sort of tried to combine them when possible, when different learning designers sort of share their competencies and they were similar across contexts. So, project management was one of the project management skills was one of the competencies that came across in some of the interviews. So, Keto in the financial sector talked significantly about having to deploy instruction to branches of the bank across the country. So he talked significantly about how project management was beneficial in that process. And then Abio in Nigeria talked about also engaging in a global corporation with teams in different parts of the globe and how using project management helped him and his team kind of like maneuver that process because the different parts of the ADI process, so the analysis part, the design part, the development part, were actually carried in by teams that were across the globe. So using project management skill ensure that the process was carried out without hiccups. Um, the learning designers also were very um, talked significantly about the use of evidence-based practices. So, for example, Emilia, in her interview, she mentioned, and I quote, "It was an environment where you constantly ask, why are you making that decision? Why are you carrying out this structure? What authors say so? Why not in a different way? Why am I doing it? Why am I doing it wrong? So in an environment that obligates you to get prepared and study more. So in this particular context, she worked for an international financial institution and she worked with individuals who had uh, PhDs and like had studied instructional design. So she constantly questioned like theoretical backgrounds, frameworks that were used, and questioned the practice rather than simply accepting it and looking for evidence-based practice that help back up the decisions made. Similar practice was carried out by Luna, who worked in a higher education institution in Chile and I have a few quotes from her, and in her particular context, in her institution, they were working very hard to integrate high flex instruction. So she felt like high flex instruction was a contingent topic within her institution. I can understand why. So she constantly had to find resources that helped back up some of the nuances related to high flex instruction or the implementation of high flex instruction in this higher education context. And Abio also talked about this use of evidence-based practice. Another important competency that was mentioned was graphic production and user experience design. So Emilia talked about how it was not only important to be able to create a graphic, but think about the experience of the user as they're interacting with the learning environment. And she also talked about ethical decision making. So in this specific context, she talked about interacting with stakeholders and them wanting like all the bells and whistles and having to think about ethically what's more important for the instruction rather than what may look like it's visually pleasing, but it's really more of a distraction. Oops, let me go back. Several of the learning designers talked about collaboration, and I kind of want to move this right here a little bit. So, there was collaboration was talked about from the perspective of collaboration within a team. And it was also talked about collaboration with stakeholders, so other individuals who were not part of the team. And then there was collaboration with the subject matter experts. So, in terms of collaboration within the team, Evelyn talked about how within her context, working for a global corporation that had teams across the globe, she talked about how they would come together, have weekly meetings as instructional designers, also have one-on-one sessions. She was the instructional design manager, so she ensured she had individual meetings with all of the teams. And then they had meetings in which they share their really good ideas so that other team members could hear them. They also had meetings in which they shared things that they were not working out, and they kind of like had brainstorming sessions. And here in her quote, she talked, if you're stuck on an idea, then you have someone else to reach out and say, hey, I'm stuck with this. Have you done something similar? And so there was a lot of a culture of sharing within her organization. Kaya in higher education in South Africa talked about having a very similar experience in which her team would come together and share out ideas or things that were not working, or talked about how they had interacted with individual faculty members. And then Celia, Luna, and Kaya, all working in higher education, talked about collaborating significantly with stakeholders, and this often meant collaborating with administrators, which I feel like many of you probably have very similar experiences. And then Keto talks significantly about the importance of collaboration with subject matter experts. And in another slide, I talked about the importance of like adaptation as well. Um, Let me move this right here. Um, Other important competencies that were shared were related to the integration of technology, especially when it came to working as a consultant. Camila felt like it was important for her as a consultant to kind of like back up her knowledge by sharing some of the theories that she knew about the field. Also, it was very important in terms of like K to 12 education, and talking about the use of theories of learning. Um, Isabel and Ruben talked about having analysis skills, or the importance of understanding needs analysis and task analysis. And that I thought was not mentioned very often, but it was sort of like unique to a very specific context related to nonprofit, was actually shared by Adriana. Adriana was a learning designer who worked for a nonprofit organization in Brazil. And in this role, she actually worked with K to 12 teachers to integrate learning design in their practice. She talked about how, and I quote, learning design is not obvious for teachers in Brazil. Normally, teachers follow a book and that's it. So for me, the basic and most common denominator that I can work with teachers is to highlight that learning is an intangible, invisible experience, because of what we need to put in a diagram and because of that, we need to put it in a diagram and make it visible for them. Then we will take this journey together with a high level of consciousness. So she used knowledge of of the design thinking process to help teachers understand how the learning process works. So rather than just simply saying, here's a book, we're going to follow the content in this book. She sort of trained teachers to operate at a different level. And she used the design thinking process to think of problems and how to identify solution, and and work through the process of designing and development and implementing those solutions. And also for them to think about the same process with their learners. So that was a very um, like eye-opening experience interacting with Adriana. And then something else that was mentioned specifically in this context of a global corporation from Lorena was behavioral traits of courage and humility. She found that when learning designers came into her team and they were open to saying, well, I don't know, or or on the other side of that, this is what I know and I want to share my idea. She felt like that was a very important competence for instructional designers, learning designers to have because it allowed them to grow more from those experiences. And just it was important for her and for someone to have these traits within her team. Um, there was also quite a bit of conversation related to culture. So culture presented itself in different ways within the interviews. There were there was culture when it came to like cultural insight, so understand a person's culture and making sure you're aware of that because they're in your team and it helps them perform in a specific way. But then Lorena and Evelyn talked about cultural adaptability. Adapting yourself to someone else's culture, and then having this aspect of cultural inclusivity in your instructional design practice. As I mentioned, Terrell, she talked about the creation of Caribbean influence material, and then Camilla talked about like the integration of Peruvian culture into her own instructional material. So again, culture was brought up in different ways within the interview. And then Abio talked about this idea of adaptability, which I sort of mentioned already, but he talked about um, when we have an idea and you're connecting with others within a team, being open to others individuals feedback and shifting your idea based on the feedback that you're giving, so not being so rigid. And Ruben also talked about that, being a contractor, working in Peru, he wasn't always in control of the instruction. So, using the feedback that was often provided by the clients that he would interact with, he felt like he needed to be very flexible to making those changes, especially when and he was working in a Peruvian context, whenever they asked to make the content more is specific to the group of individuals who were going to use it, he felt like he had to be flexible about that and, be more adaptable. Oops, sorry. And then there were various aspects related to creativity that were mentioned by the learning designers in the interviews. Evelyn, Ruben, and Kaya all talked about this aspect of creativity that had to come through in their practice as learning designers because they felt like they wanted to show something that was new, innovative, um, and they felt like, as an instructional designer, as a learning designer, you constantly have to think about how you're not only presenting the content, but the strategies that you're using to engage the learners in, the learning process. So Kaya in particular, and let me see if I can move this. Kaya mentioned, but now I have to be able to convince people of what works or what cannot work. At the same time, I have to to be creative to say, if we can't do it like this way, we can't do it in this other way. So I believe that now I have to be more creative. because I want to present ideas and suggestions that are going to be interesting to people, that are going to wow them. And at the same time, I do not want to forget that this is a professional course that I'm working on. And it was really interesting to hear Kaya mention this because she was actually just an instructional design intern. And she was already talking about it from the perspective of, someone who is going to be in the profession for a while. So she felt like a huge responsibility being in this role of learning design intern. And then Adriana talked about creativity through storytelling. So for her working with K to 12 teachers in Brazil, she felt like she had to sort of like engage the teachers in this learning design process through almost through like a storytelling process. So she worked in the design thinking aspect and the storytelling process of it, and she felt like it was important for her because of her cultural background and the cultural background of the teachers that she was working with. And overall, throughout all of the different interviews, the learning designers talked about competencies related to online digital learning, hybrid learning, and then several of them talked about mobile learning. Um, so, in various contexts, the importance of online instruction, multimedia skills, e-learning came throughout the interview. So, not only was it important to have these other competencies, but it was also important to have these competencies within an online environment. So as part of the process of working in the book, I also engage in analyzing the interviews with the different learning designers through a deep canvassing lens. And deep canvassing is it's a voter contact model in which organizers engage with voters and they try to like engage in this process through a non-judgmental process when you're like sort of open to understanding someone else's perspective, but you're also very open to share your vulnerabilities. And I did this as part of a presentation that I doing for a different conference. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me because as I was coding the interviews, I was able to see that some of the different aspects of the experiences that these learning designers were having, I found that they were not only engaging in competencies that were related to instructional design practice that all of you may be already familiar with, but they were also engaging in competencies that were more of being vulnerable and being compassionate to the individuals that they were interacting with within their team or stakeholders that they were working with or administrators that they interacted with as part of their job. So these instructional designers or learning designers were working towards finding common ground. They were also acknowledging the barriers and challenges that they were experiencing. They were adjusting based on the needs of others. They talked about collective action and building communities, in particular, Isabel talking about her community of learning designers in her area. They talked about cultural differences, so understanding the role of like portraying Indo-Chinese individuals in their work or understanding different languages in the workplace. They also were engaging in reflective questioning and exploration of reasons. Why are we doing this? Why can't we change this? Questioning their teammates, questioning themselves. They were engaging in empathetic listening on and understanding diverse viewpoints. Several of them talked about trying to avoid non-confrontational dialogue. So not imposing themselves as learning designers and saying like, hey, look, I have this knowledge, but instead trying to listen to others' perspective and bringing their own perspective to the table. Several of the interviewees talked about gradual change and being patient. So, in particular, Keto, he mentioned how he understood that, engaging in online learning practices and mobile learning practices were not always accepted within the organization, but being able to say, it's okay. I know that time is going to change. This practice is going to change over time, and then being empathetic for different learners and exploring on different underlying beliefs. Um, Thank you for the warning. So that's sort of like in a way the way that I've summarize a little bit of the book. There's more to it, but I have a few copies of the book and I would like to share them with some of you. And I forgot to mention this, but there's a little bit of a quiz now so that I can give out. I have a few copies, as I mentioned. So if you can use the chat, and I'm gonna bring the chat up. If I can use the chat, um, for the first two individuals that are able to share answers to this question, I have copies of the book for you. So the first question, what is one major factor that influences how learning designers adapt their design decisions in global South settings, based on what I have shared today? Okay, two in the, oh, one major shot. We have two cultural traditions. So Brandon and Latoya. Are those my first two? Yes, thank you. And I'm gonna put my email so you can email me your address in the chat. So Latoya and Brandon, um, I have two more copies, and the first two that answer the next question. Name three countries represented in learning designers in context. Three in one text, in one chat. Diane, anyone else? Oksana. Thank you. So Diane and Oksana, I just share my email address. If you can email me, I'll make sure that you get copies of the book. Um, I'm sorry, I'm running over time. I apologize. If you didn't get a copy of the book, here's a scan that you can use if you would like to get a copy of it. The book was published last December by Routledge, and it's available for purchase. Um, and I don't like to leave without giving you something. I also published a book last year. It's called Feminist Pedagogy for Teaching Online. It was published by Athabasca University Press, and it is available open access. And I'm going to stop sharing because I'm going to put the link to the slides in the chat as well, so you can access this later. Sorry. And you can download a copy of the book from Athabasca University Press. Thank you all.